They read my father's will in Aunt Celeste's living room at 9 in the morning, while I was still at the cemetery, choosing the stone he had requested. My cousin sent me one blurry photograph of 6 coffee cups, 2 pens, and several pages spread across a glass table, followed by the message, "They said you did not need to be here." I stared at the photograph long enough to notice how confidently everyone had gathered around a document none of them had verified. At 9:47, my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as the executor, then asked one question that made me realize the meeting had gone wrong before the first page was read. If you have ever been excluded from a family conversation because people thought your quietness meant you had no standing, stay with me until the end. Because the call I received that morning did not just put me back in the room. It showed my family that a real legacy does not disappear because the loudest people meet without you. My name is Elise Warren. I was 34, and I worked as an acquisitions assistant for the public library system in Brookhaven County. My job was to track records, purchase orders, missing forms, and donations that arrived with stories attached. I had always been good with paper, which was probably why my father trusted me with the kind that mattered most. Let me back up. My father, Owen Warren, owned a brick farmhouse outside Calder Ridge, 18 acres of pasture and walnut trees, a small rental duplex in town, and the old family workshop where he repaired clocks after he retired. The land came from my grandmother in 1995, but Dad always said my mother was the one who made it possible to keep. She taught school for 27 years, paid bills with a pencil in the margins, and knew which repairs could wait and which ones quietly became disasters. When my mother died in 2012, the house became too silent for him and too full of memory for everyone else. My older brother Nolan visited for holidays and big decisions. My Aunt Celeste, Dad's sister, came by when there were guests to impress. I came on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and most Saturdays because grief does not care whether anyone is watching. I cooked, cleaned gutters, scheduled appointments, and sat at the kitchen table while Dad fixed clocks that did not need fixing. He used to tell me, "Time is honest, Elise. People can dress it up, but the hands keep moving." That was his way of saying documents, dates, and patterns mattered more than speeches. He was not suspicious by nature. He was just old enough to know that some relatives treated patience as permission. Nolan was 40, confident, impatient, and very good at sounding like the adult in any room. He ran operations for a landscaping company and believed that made him an expert on land, value, and every decision Dad had made slowly. He loved our father, but his love often arrived with a plan. Sell the pasture, lease the duplex differently, turn the workshop into short-term storage, modernize the farmhouse. He used that word whenever he meant erase. Aunt Celeste encouraged him because she had wanted a voice in the Warren property since my grandmother died. She believed Dad had been unfairly sentimental. She thought the family land should have been divided in 3 shares years earlier, though she had never paid a tax bill, replaced a fence post, or sat beside Dad when his blood pressure dropped low enough to scare him. Dad made his estate plan in 2020 after a mild stroke left him in the hospital for 6 days. He met with an attorney named Mr. Keene and created the Warren Family Trust. The farmhouse, pasture, walnut grove, duplex, and workshop were transferred into the trust by recorded deed. His will poured everything else into the trust and nominated Mr. Keene as executor, with me as successor trustee once the estate opened. The trust said no real property could be sold, mortgaged, listed, or divided for 18 months after Dad's death. It also said I had the right to live in the farmhouse during that period, with expenses paid from trust income, because Dad knew I had left my apartment to care for him. Nolan and I were both beneficiaries, but voting control of property decisions stayed with me until the waiting period ended. Celeste received a cash gift and several family pieces from my grandmother, but no control over land. Dad asked me not to discuss it. He said Nolan would either perform kindness or declare war, and either way, Dad would lose the comfort of knowing what was real. I asked if secrecy would make it worse later. He was sitting at the workshop bench, holding a tiny brass gear between tweezers, and he said, "Later can have paper. Now I need peace." I did not like that answer, but I understood it. Dad had watched families behave beautifully in public and terribly around property. He wanted his last years to belong to ordinary care, not negotiations disguised as visits. The day he signed the trust, he took me to the county recorder's office before we went home. He wanted me to see the deed transfer stamped because he said recorded paper was different from private paper. The clerk slid the document under the stamp, and the sound echoed in the small room. Dad looked tired, but his shoulders lowered after that sound. On the drive home, he told me, if they ever read the wrong paper in the wrong room, do not chase it. Let the right person call. What right person? The executor, he said. That is why I named one who does not need an invitation from your aunt. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Later, I would remember that sentence almost word for word. The first small overreach came 5 months before Dad died. He had started using a walker after a fall, and I had moved into the downstairs den to help at night. One Saturday I came home from the pharmacy and found Nolan standing in the pasture with a surveyor. They were measuring near the road frontage while Dad slept in the recliner. "Why is there a surveyor here?" I asked. Nolan did not even look embarrassed. "Preliminary boundaries, nothing official. Dad did not mention a survey. Dad does not need to be burdened with every practical step." The surveyor looked away. I asked him to leave until Dad approved any work. Nolan waited until the man drove off before turning on me. "You are confusing caregiving with ownership." That line stayed with me because it was exactly what he wanted people to believe. If I knew the medication list, I was controlling. If I knew the property tax deadline, I was meddling. If I knew where Dad kept the workshop keys, I was hoarding access. Care became suspicious as soon as property entered the conversation. The second pressure thread came through my cousin Bethany, Celeste's daughter. Bethany was 28, newly divorced, and renting one side of Dad's duplex at a reduced rate. Celeste began telling her that if Nolan managed the estate, he would let her stay, but if I had influence, I would raise the rent to market and push her out. None of that was true, but fear does not wait for evidence. Bethany called me one night, whispering from the duplex kitchen. "Aunt Celeste says I should sign something saying Nolan knows the properties best. Do not sign anything you do not understand. She says if I stay neutral, I am choosing you. Neutral is not a crime." "It feels like one in this family," she said. I wanted to tell her everything then. I wanted to say Dad had already protected her lease for 12 months after his death, as long as she paid the reduced rent on time. But the trust was Dad's choice to reveal, not mine. So I told her to breathe, keep copies of anything she received, and call me before signing. The bigger overreach came 7 weeks before Dad died. Nolan brought Celeste to the house with a printed plan for the property. It showed the farmhouse as a listing, the pasture divided into 4 lots, the Walnut Grove leased separately, and the workshop cleared for equipment storage. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table in his robe, pale and exhausted from a medication change. Nolan laid the plan in front of him and said, "This is just to make sure we're not caught flat-footed." Dad looked at the paper for a long time. "I am still breathing." Celeste touched his shoulder. "Owen, nobody is trying to rush you." "Then why are you bringing me a map of my life cut into pieces?" Nolan's jaw tightened. "Because somebody has to think clearly." Dad pushed the paper back with 2 fingers. "Clear does not always mean kind." Nolan looked at me. "This is what happens when one person keeps him isolated." I almost answered. "Dad did it for me." "A lease keeps my appointments," he said. "You keep bringing appraisals." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Celeste folded the plan and put it back in her purse, but I saw her eyes. She was not finished. She was waiting. Dad died on a Monday at 6:03 in the evening, with a clock open on the workbench and rain hitting the workshop roof. He had wanted to sit there that afternoon, so I wrapped him in a quilt and made tea he barely touched. He looked at the clock he was repairing and whispered, "Some things only stop if nobody winds them." Those were the last clear words he said to me. The funeral was 4 days later. Nolan handled the public parts, the receiving line, the flowers, the thank you cards, the firm handshake version of grief. I handled the quiet parts, like finding Dad's cufflinks, bringing his old workshop apron for the memory table, and choosing the verse he had marked in my mother's hymnal. Celeste praised Nolan for being strong. She told people I was having a hard time, as if my grief were a performance issue. After the burial, Mr. Keene's office sent formal notices for the will and trust review. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 2. I received mine by email and certified mail. So did Nolan, Bethany, Celeste, and 2 small beneficiaries. The notice said no private reading of copies should be relied upon before the executor verified the original documents. Celeste ignored that sentence. The night before the scheduled meeting, Bethany texted me that her mother had called everyone to the duplex for coffee in the morning. I was not invited. Nolan had found a will copy in Dad's desk, and Celeste wanted to avoid surprises. I told Bethany not to argue. I told her to send me a photo if anything looked wrong. At 8:55 the next morning, I was at the cemetery office choosing Dad's stone inscription. I wanted it to match my mother's in style and spacing, and the clerk was patient while I tried not to cry over font samples. My phone buzzed. It was Bethany. They are starting. Then came the blurry photo. Dad's old 2017 will lay open on Celeste's coffee table. That version left the house and landed equally to Nolan and me, with a suggestion that we cooperate in sale or retention. It did not mention the 2020 trust because it came before the trust existed. Nolan saw equal shares and heard permission. Celeste saw confusion and smelled opportunity. I called Bethany. She answered without speaking, and I could hear voices in the background. Nolan said, "My family read the will without me once before when Grandma died, and it did not change the result. Elise can hear about it later," Bethany whispered. "He knows I called you." Then Celeste's voice came through. "Hang up, Bethany. This is for heirs, not dramatics." The line went dead. That was the breaking point. My family read the will without me, not because they forgot, not because they were confused, but because excluding me made the old copy easier to believe. They wanted a room where nobody would say current document, recorded trust, or executor authority. I stood in the cemetery office holding a pen over Dad's inscription form. My first instinct was to drive straight to the duplex, walk in, and put the 2020 notice on the table. But I heard Dad in the recorder's office saying, "Do not chase the wrong paper. Let the right person call." So I did the quiet thing. I forwarded Bethany's photo to Mr. Keene's office with one sentence. "They are reading a 2017 copy without the executor present." At 9:47, Mr. Keene called me. His voice was calm, but not casual. "Elise, I need you to listen carefully. Do not go to the duplex. I am calling Nolan next, and then Celeste. The original will and trust control this estate, not any copy on a coffee table. Did Dad expect this?" He paused. "Your father prepared for it. That was the action." I did not interrupt the unauthorized reading. I notified the executor, preserved the photo, and let him make the formal calls. Mr. Keene also told me to finish the cemetery paperwork because Dad had wanted that done with care, not abandoned because others were behaving badly. For 20 minutes after that, everything seemed falsely calm. I chose the inscription, paid the deposit, and sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel. No one called me. No one apologized. I almost convinced myself Mr. Keene's call had ended the damage before it spread. Then Bethany texted again. Nolan had already called a real estate agent to walk the pasture that afternoon. Celeste was making a list of grandmother's furniture. Someone had told Bethany her reduced rent would be reviewed because the estate needs market discipline. The wrong paper had not stayed on the coffee table. It had started moving through the family like permission. Mr. Keene called me again at 10:31. "Come to my office at noon," he said. "I am moving the formal review up. Bring your notice, your identification, and any keys your father gave you." At noon, I walked into Mr. Keen's conference room and found Nolan already there, angry in a pressed shirt, with Celeste beside him. Bethany sat near the wall, pale and guilty. She gave me the smallest nod. Mr. Keen had the original will, trust certification, recorded deed, and a phone log on the table. Nolan started before anyone sat down. "This is unnecessary. We read Dad's will." Mr. Keen looked at him. "You read a revoked copy." It was in his desk. Old copies often remain in desks. Celeste said, "Owen would not hide something this important from his family." Mr. Keen opened the original will. He did not hide it. He placed it with the executor. The fallout began as Mr. Keen read. The 2020 will revoked all prior wills. It poured remaining assets into the Warren Family Trust. It nominated Mr. Keen as executor and confirmed me as successor trustee. Then he read the trust summary. No real property sale, listing, mortgage, division, lease termination, or furniture removal for 18 months without my written consent and executor notice. Bethany's duplex lease would remain at the existing reduced rent for 12 months if she paid on time and maintained the property. Celeste would receive my grandmother's cedar chest, the silver tea service, and $25,000. Nolan and I remained equal remainder beneficiaries, but property control during the waiting period was mine. Nolan's face changed when he heard equal beneficiaries, but my control. It was the look of a man trying to call something unfair while realizing the money itself had not been stolen from him. "So a lease can block everything," he said. "A lease must administer the trust," Mr. Keen said. "That is not the same as personal ownership. She can live in the house for 18 months because she left her apartment to care for your father." Celeste folded her arms. "Convenient." Mr. Keen slid another paper forward. "Your brother documented that arrangement in writing while competent. He also left a letter." The letter was 2 pages in Dad's careful handwriting. Mr. Keen read only the first paragraph aloud. "Dad wrote that he had watched Nolan and Celeste discuss property while he was still living, and he did not want grief used as a shortcut. He wrote that I was not being rewarded for being quiet. I was being entrusted because I had been steady when steadiness was needed." Bethany began crying silently. Nolan stared at the table. "He wrote that about me?" Mr. Keen said. "He wrote it for all of you." Celeste tried one more angle. "What about the copy we read? It said cooperate." "The trust still asks for cooperation," Mr. Keen said. "It simply prevents cooperation from being replaced by pressure." That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Mr. Keen did not let the meeting dissolve into wounded silence. He took out a second folder and read a preservation notice line by line. It named the farmhouse, the pasture, the walnut grove, the duplex leases, the workshop contents, and Dad's clock repair records. No one was to remove furniture, contact tenants about changes, schedule inspections, invite buyers, or represent authority over the property without written approval from the executor and trustee. Nolan said, "This makes us sound like criminals." Mr. Keen answered, "It makes expectations clear." Then he asked each person at the table to acknowledge receipt. Bethany signed first with her hand shaking. I signed next. Celeste hesitated, looking offended by the pen itself, but signed after Mr. Keen said he would note refusal. Nolan wrote his name hard enough to dent the paper. Mr. Keen also called the real estate agent while we sat there. He put the phone on speaker only after identifying himself. "No site visit is authorized for the Warren Trust property today or at any time without my written office notice," he said. The agent sounded confused. "Mr. Nuld, Warren told me the family wanted valuation options." No one's face flushed. Mr. Keen said, "Mr. Warren does not have authority to schedule that visit." The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it did something the will reading alone had not done. It reached outside the room and stopped the wrong story from becoming action. I felt no joy hearing Nolan embarrassed. I felt relief, and underneath it, the exhaustion of realizing how much damage can happen between one old paper and one phone call. Before we left, Mr. Keen made me sign the trustee acceptance. He read the duty paragraph aloud. Maintain trust property, keep accurate accounts, treat beneficiaries fairly, avoid personal use beyond authorized occupancy, preserve records, send quarterly reports. I had thought being named meant being defended. In that moment, I understood it also meant being watched by the same documents that protected me. Your father trusted you, Mr. Keene said. That does not mean you get to act without explaining yourself. Good, I said, though my voice was thin. I think I will need the explaining. He handed me a blank ledger and told me to start with the cemetery deposit, the utility bills, and the duplex rent already due that week. Begin where the grief is smallest, he said. Small records keep large mistakes from growing. I wrote the first entry before leaving his office because motion felt safer than outrage. The page steadied my hands. After the meeting, Celeste left first, stiff with embarrassment. Nolan followed but stopped in the hallway to take a call from the real estate agent, telling him not to come. Bethany stayed behind. Mr. Keene asked if I could speak with her privately because she was frightened about the duplex. We stepped into the small side office where estate files lined the walls. That was the reveal, though it did not feel dramatic. It felt like two tired women, standing in a room full of paper and finally telling the truth. Bethany said, "I am sorry I sent the photo and then froze." "You sent enough." Mom said I was betraying the family. "You were protecting the record." She wiped her eyes. "Did Uncle Owen really protect my lease?" "Yes. He knew the divorce left you stretched. He told me once that reduced rent was not charity if it gave you time to stand up again." Bethany covered her mouth. "Mom said he only let me stay because she pushed him. Dad made the lease with Mr. Keene. He wanted you safe. He just did not want the duplex used as leverage. Leverage against you. Against anyone," I said. "But yes, mostly against me." Bethany looked toward the closed door. I should have said something when they started. "You did," I said. "You called me. That does not feel like enough. Sometimes enough is not a speech. Sometimes it is one photo before people can deny the room." She nodded, and I could see her gathering herself around that sentence. The turn came that evening. Celeste called Bethany to demand she stop feeding Elise ammunition. Nolan was on the call too, insisting that Bethany had made everyone look bad. Bethany put the phone on speaker and called me from another line so I could hear, but she did not ask me to speak. For the first time, she answered them herself. "You made yourselves look bad when you read a revoked will and told me to hang up." Celeste gasped. "Bethany." "No," Bethany said. "Uncle Owen protected my lease because he knew you might use it to make me obey. I am not signing anything for you. I am not calling a lease dramatic. And I am not pretending a coffee table reading is the same as an executor." Nolan said, "You do not understand the estate." "Then I will wait for Mr. Keene's letters," she said, like everyone should have done. I sat on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear and cried for the first time that day. Not because Bethany had saved me. The documents had done that. I cried because someone who had been scared finally sounded like she belonged to herself. The next 45 days were heavy with ordinary work. Mr. Keene filed the will with the probate court, recorded the trustee acceptance, sent beneficiary notices, and wrote to the real estate agent explaining that no listing was authorized. I changed the house security code under written instruction because Nolan had given it to two people without asking. I opened a trust account for rents and expenses. Bethany signed a lease acknowledgement that kept her rent stable for 12 months. Nolan did not challenge the trust, but he did sulk through every letter. He asked for appraisals, expense reports, photographs of repairs, and copies of the deed. Mr. Keene sent what he was entitled to receive and nothing more. That boundary irritated Nolan more than any argument would have. One afternoon, I met Mr. Keene at the farmhouse to inventory Dad's workshop. We photographed each clock, each labeled drawer, each envelope of tiny screws. In the bottom drawer of the workbench, we found the receipt from the day Dad recorded the deed. On the back, he had written, "Time needs witnesses too." I sat on the stool and read it twice. Mr. Keene said, "Your father was very clear. He had to be. He wanted to be," Mr. Keene said. There is a difference. That distinction helped me. Dad had not left me a trap to spring on Nolan. He had left his structure because he knew love without boundaries could become a tool in the wrong hands. The workshop inventory became its own kind of memorial. Bethany came on Saturdays to help because Dad had once repaired a cuckoo clock for her after her divorce and refused to charge her. She brought labels, packing paper, and a thermos of coffee. We worked slowly, listing the mantel clocks, the pocket watches, the boxes of spare faces, and the handwritten repair cards Dad kept in alphabetical order. One card had Nolan's name on it. It was for a broken wristwatch Nolan had thrown in a drawer when he was 19. Dad had repaired it, polished the case, and written, "Waiting until he wants it." I showed it to Bethany, and she pressed her lips together. "Does Nolan know this is here?" she asked. "I do not think so." "Are you going to tell him?" "Yes," I said. "Not today." That was the strange work of the trust. It made me hold things for people before they were ready to receive them. If I had been acting from anger, I could have buried that card in a box and called it organization. Instead, I photographed it, logged it, and put it in the personal property tray with Dad's note facing up. Later that afternoon, Celeste came by without warning. She stopped at the workshop door, but did not step inside. Bethany stiffened, expecting another demand. Celeste looked at the labeled boxes and said, "I did not know Owen kept repair cards for everyone. He kept records of what people brought him," I said, "even after they forgot?" "Especially then." Celeste looked away. "Your grandmother used to do that too." It was the first sentence she had spoken about history without trying to own it. She did not apologize that day, but she stayed for 20 minutes and helped Bethany wrap clock faces in paper. Sometimes repair starts with someone touching the work instead of directing it. Nolan came to the house 3 weeks later. He did not call first. He stood on the porch with Dad's old toolbox, the one Dad had left him in the personal property list. I almost did not open the door, but the security camera had already recorded him, and he looked less angry than hollow. "I found this in my garage," he said. "Dad gave it to me years ago. I think he meant for it to be with the workshop things." I took it from him. "Thank you." He looked past me into the hallway. "Can I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside. He walked to the kitchen and stopped where Dad's chair used to sit. The house felt different with Nolan in it after the reading. Not because he had less right to grieve, but because he could no longer pretend grief gave him authority. "I read his letter again," he said. "Which part?" "The part about steadiness." I waited. "I hated it," he said. "Not because it was false, because it was accurate. That was the first honest sentence he had given me in months." "You treated the house like it was already empty," I said. He closed his eyes briefly. "I know." "You told Bethany to hang up." "I know." "You let Aunt Celeste tell people I did not need to be there." He looked at me then. "I wanted a room where you could not slow me down." The truth was ugly, but it was truth. I respected it more than another speech about efficiency. "Dad knew that," I said. Nolan swallowed. "That is the worst part." Accountability came in pieces after that. Nolan wrote Bethany an apology for pressuring her about the lease. He emailed the real estate agent and copied Mr. Keem, confirming there would be no listing. He agreed that Aunt Celeste would receive the cedar chest and tea service after the inventory, not before. None of that made him gentle overnight, but it made him responsible in ways documents could measure. Celeste was slower. She avoided me until the day Mr. Keene distributed her cash gift. Then she came to the farmhouse to pick up the cedar chest. Bethany came with her, which told me she did not want her mother speaking for her anymore. Celeste stood in the foyer and looked at my mother's photograph. "Owen always trusted paper more than people," she said. "No," I said. "He used paper when people gave him reason." Bethany inhaled softly, but Celeste did not argue. She ran her hand over the cedar chest and said, "I was angry that your grandmother left the land to him." "I know. I told myself he owed me a say. A say is different from control." She looked at me for a long moment. "You sound like him." I did not know whether she meant it as praise or accusation. Maybe it was both. By the end of the first year, the trust had done what Dad wanted. It slowed us down. The farmhouse was repaired instead of listed. The Walnut Grove lease was renewed. The duplex stayed stable. Nolan received reports and stopped treating every report like a personal insult. Bethany finished a certification course and began paying full rent after the protected year ended. Not because anyone forced her, but because she wanted to stand on her own. The most surprising repair came on Dad's birthday. Nolan arrived with a clock wrapped in a towel. It was the one Dad had been fixing the day he died. Nolan had taken it from the workshop months before without telling anyone, back when he still thought possession proved something. He set it on the kitchen table. "I should have listed it in the inventory," he said. "Yes, I want it here." We wound it together because neither of us was sure whose hands could manage it alone. The ticking started unevenly, then settled into a quiet rhythm. For a moment, the house sounded the way it had when Dad was alive. Nolan looked at the clock and said, "I thought if I controlled the estate, I could prove I mattered." "Did it work?" He shook his head. "No. You mattered before the estate." His face changed, and I saw how much of his greed had been fear wearing a better suit. That did not erase what he had done. It helped explain why he had done it, which is sometimes where repair begins. We did not become a perfect family. Aunt Celeste still spoke carefully around me, as if every sentence might become a document. Nolan still needed reminders. I still had days when I resented being the steady one. But the house did not get sold in panic. Bethany did not lose her home. Dad's workshop remained intact. And the formal reading, the real one, became the version our family could not rewrite. Legacy is not protected by being included in every room. Sometimes it is protected by the right document waiting outside the wrong room, and by one honest call that reminds everyone. Truth does not need permission to enter. My family read the will without me. Then the executor called, and Dad's real wishes finally took their seat at the table.